You're listening to Accents, a radio show for literature, art, and culture. I'm your host, Katerina Stoikova, and my guest is writer Kristin Czarnecki. Hi, Kristin.
Hi, Katerina. How are you?
I'm doing great, very happy to talk to you. And let me introduce you with a few biographical notes to our listeners.
Okay.
Kristin Czarnecki is an English professor at Georgetown College, where she teaches a variety of literature and composition courses. She's living out the pandemic at home with her husband and 2 cats and hopes that everyone watching this is safe and well. First of all, what are the names of the cats?
Well, one of them is Ziggy, and he might make an appearance because he's roaming around right now. I have 2 black cats. One is named Ziggy after David Bowie's character Ziggy Stardust, and the other is named Merlin. So 2 black cats that we got from Woodford Humane Society a couple years ago. So,
yeah. And you have a new book.
I do. It was published in March by Main Street Rag, and it's called The First Kristin, The Story of a Naming. And it's a memoir that I wrote about the experience of being named after a deceased sister, my parents' first child. And in the family, of course, we had always known about her. We knew the circumstances of her death. We knew it was a terribly sad event in my parents' lives. But in recent years, I began thinking about her more and more and what it means to have her name and what her life and death has meant for my family over the years. And so I started exploring a little bit, having conversations with my parents and my brother and sister, doing little bits of research here and there to put the whole story together as well as I could.
I would love to hear you read about it.
Okay. All right, well, I'll start off by reading the first couple of pages, which is obviously the stepping off point and will give a bit of an idea of how this all got underway. Okay. She heads straight for the blue tricycle parked under the Christmas tree. In her pink and white special occasion dress and bare feet, she pushes the trike back and forth a few times before clambering onto the seat and trying the pedals. Next, she's sitting on the floor, opening more presents, throwing wrapping paper, tissue, and box lids over her shoulder like it's old hat, although she's just a toddler. She glances at the camera once or twice. Mainly, she focuses on her gifts, sometimes turning to her father for affirmation of how she should react to the bounty spread before her. Her mother films it all. They are not yet my mother and father. An 8x10 framed photograph of her sits atop a table in the background. She concentrates as she pulls the next doll or toy out of a box or bag. One of the presents is a tiny pair of flip-flops. Her dad helps her with them, fumbling a bit, putting them on the wrong feet. Christmas tree tinsel dangles in clumps from the bottom branches almost to the floor. The mountain of presents seems never-ending. It's a bright, warm scene. I can almost smell the breakfast they've had, or the coffee brewing, or the turkey that may already be roasting in the oven. I'm named after her, this child in the grainy video who died when she was 3 years old, 8.5 years before I was born. Until now, I've only seen her in small black and white photographs in which she seemed frozen and far, far away. Now in my 40s, I'm watching her spring to life for the first time. My husband Paul and I watch the video on our TV. Later, I'll add it to my desktop and watch it over and over again. Now, this first time, I brace myself for what I'm about to see. I arm myself with tissues, lean forward, hold my breath, and I cry and cry. In our family, she's always been called the first Kristin. My parents are voracious readers who named their daughter after the heroine in Sigrid Undset's Kristin Lavransdatter trilogy, set in medieval Norway. I find myself needing now to explore this act of naming, this legacy, this spectral sister. I feel sorry for her, robbed of life at such a young age. I even miss her sometimes, if it's possible to miss someone you've never met. I want to know more about her. I want it known that she existed, that her time on earth mattered. I want to reflect on what having her name means for me and my family. Write what's tearing at your heart, what you need to resolve, Ana Castillo advises her students. I had originally written, I want her to know she's not forgotten, but as Undertaker Thomas Lynch affirms, there is nothing, once you are dead, that can be done to you, or for you, or with you, or about you, that will do you any good or any harm. Remember, he repeats several times, the dead don't care. All the same, undertakings carry tremendous significance, for they are the things we do to vest the lives we lead against the cold, the meaningless, the void, the noisy blather, and the blinding dark. Our undertakings, Lynch claims, seek to make some sense of life and living, dying, and the dead. To undertake is to bind oneself to the performance of a task, to pledge or promise to get it done. So I set out to perform the task of writing about the first Kristin, binding myself to this lost little girl to try to know her better, understand myself more deeply, and explore the unique phenomenon of a family with one name for two sisters. This is my pledge, my promise to her. I know she doesn't care, that the dead don't care. Yet doesn't the phrase nevertheless imbue the dead with some semblance of agency? So that's how the book begins, and it was the process of writing it was spurred in large part by these old, over 50-year-old home movies that we found in my parents' basement of the first Kristin. The next bit I'll read shows a little bit of the research that I did in trying to learn about the phenomenon of what I came to know is a necronym. So this section begins necronym. Necronym. The word arose from my internet searches on naming child after deceased sibling. I had never heard the word before. According to Wikipedia, it's a reference to or name of a person who has died. In the article, What's in a Necronym, Jeannie Vanasco gets more specific. It usually means a name shared with a dead sibling, she writes. Vanasco's middle name, which she goes by, is that of her father's first child, who died in a car accident when she was 16, 8 years before the next Jeannie was born. And the next Jeannie didn't learn about her deceased half-sibling until she was 8 years old, and then only sort of accidentally. Until the late 19th century, Vanasco writes, necronyms were not uncommon among Americans and Europeans. If a child died in infancy, his or her name was often given to the next child, a natural consequence of high birth rates and high infant mortality rates. She cites Ludwig van Beethoven, Vincent van Gogh, and Salvador Dali as among those who bear the name of a deceased sibling. In their 1989 Dictionary of Superstitions, she continues, folklorists Iona Opie and Moira Tatum offer one reason for the necronym's decline. Many parents feared it was a murderous curse. Another possible curse, the name haunts the child for life. Have I been haunted? By the thought of my parents' grief, yes. By having the name, no, I don't think so. In fact, I've sometimes felt the first Kristin and I have shared a very close conspiracy, to quote Virginia Woolf's description of her bond with her sister Vanessa. I say this because there have been several times in my life when I'm pretty sure I might have died, but didn't. When I was 2 and drank a bottle of cough medicine, codeine, the year my family lived in Cologne, Germany, I was able to reach it on top of the low refrigerator and guzzle the whole thing down. I was rushed to the emergency room and had my stomach pumped. My dad was at a conference in another town and got a call to get to the hospital immediately. Here we go again, he thought. The doctor said that if I survived, there would likely be brain damage. There wasn't, although my siblings got a lot of mileage out of that over the years. When I was 15, babysitting 2 young children for a family in the neighborhood, it was dark, the doorbell rang, and I opened it to a woman who asked if she could come in and use the phone. I can't remember why. Against my better judgment, I let her in. About 20 seconds later, the mother's brother happened to stop by and come into the house for something. Seeing him, the woman hurriedly left. Phil looked at me in surprise and disappointment and said never to let a stranger into the house again. When I was 17 and took my parents' brand new Camry out for a spin on country roads with my friend Mia, snow was starting to thaw, the first scent of spring was in the air, and my favorite thing to do on days like that was drive around with the windows down and music blasting. We drove around a curve going much too fast and hit a patch of ice. The car fishtailed wildly on the narrow road with a drop into a wooded area on either side. Somehow we didn't flip or go over the edge. We just skidded to a halt, sat in shock for a minute, and slowly drove to a car wash. Is it too woo-woo to imagine the first Kristin was watching over me, making sure our parents didn't lose another child, especially the one with the same name? Of course it is, but I will fess up and say that for a long time, I believe she was my guardian angel. So the book, The First Kristin, The Story of a Naming, goes on to, as I said, explore the situation of having her name, what that means for me, the effect of it on my parents and siblings. And because I'm an English professor, I look to literature And I think of the literature that's had a strong impact on me over the years, and why that might be, and some of it resonates. So there's some discussion of literature in here, a little bit on psychology, as I learned about various aspects surrounding the naming of children. And mostly, though, I wondered about who she was and who she might have been. And so this next bit I'll read has to do with that, kind of wondering who she was and wishing I had known her. What kind of individual was the first one of us, the first Kristin? I read pieces I come across about families contending with the loss of a child, such as Tom Hart's graphic memoir, Rosalie Lightning, which tells of the sudden death of his almost 2-year-old daughter. I realize that I am beginning to collect the stories of dead children, he writes, as he and his wife mourn their loss. I seem to be curating such a collection as well. In Children Don't Always Live, Jason Green writes of the death of his 2-year-old daughter, Greta, killed when a piece of masonry fell 8 stories from an improperly maintained building and struck her in the head while she sat on a bench on the Upper West Side of Manhattan with her grandmother. He considers her full, promising life at the time. At 2, your child is a person, he says. She has opinions and fixed beliefs, preferences and tendencies, a group of friends and favorite foods. How much more so for an almost 4-year-old? Studies say our personality is fixed by about age 5, which means the first Kristin was very nearly fully formed. What sort of person was she? Probably hyper-articulate, as firstborns often are. My dad said she was precocious and the joy of our lives. My mother said, smart as a whip. What were her likes and dislikes? Her favorite toys and stuffed animals? Did she gravitate toward books? Had she begun to learn to read? Did she have friends, a sense of humor? What were her habits, her favorite words and expressions? Was she left-handed like I am? These are the things I want to know, and I have asked my parents if they would be willing to tell me more about her. Of course, they would always say, but then they never did. And so I write about trying to excavate the story of the first Kristin, and in order to do so, I had to, of course, ask my parents a lot of questions, and I wanted to do so as gently and compassionately as possible. I didn't want to, they were always willing to speak about her, but I didn't want to raise too many terrible memories for them. So it was interesting writing something that I really felt the need to explore, while at the same time having to maneuver carefully the people who knew the most about it and whom I could ask. This last bit I'll read has to do with a psychological term I learned called replacement child. And so I'll just read a little bit about that. The term replacement child was coined in the 1960s by psychologist Albert Cain and Barbara Cain, in reference to a child who is conceived to take the place of a child who has died. Over the years, the term has been expanded to include a child who is already a member of the family, but takes on the role of a dead or impaired sibling, as well as a child who is adopted to replace an idealized child his or her parents were unable to conceive. That's a quote from a book called Replacement Children, The Unconscious Script by Rita Batat-Silverman and Abigail Brenner. The authors explained that the term has come to denote not necessarily the parent's conscious choice to replace a child, but rather the child's experience of feeling like a replacement. The book is blurbed by a clinical psychologist, a professor of psychiatry, and a child bereavement counselor, so I bought it, and for better or for worse, some of it strikes a chord, including sections like what's in a name and naming a child after a deceased sibling, with a subsection called a blessing or an albatross. For many replacement children, the authors write, being named for a deceased sibling carries consequences that may follow them the rest of their lives. The expectation placed upon them by the parents that they, the replacement child, will fulfill the hopes and dreams of the deceased child is now compounded and cemented by giving the very same name as the deceased sibling. It's as if the replacement child does not have the right to their own identity. And when that happens, they may not know who they are, why they're here, and there may be real confusion and conflict while navigating the road towards selfhood. It's another quote from their book. I read these words over and over, but cannot find myself in them. And I wonder how to detect the difference between ordinary confusion and conflict while navigating the road towards selfhood, to be expected of anyone, and particular issues stemming from having the name of a dead sibling. And I'll jump down the page a bit and finish with just a last couple of paragraphs. Salvador Dali was named after a brother who was born in 1901 and died of gastroenteritis 9 months before the second Salvador was born in 1904. It seems as if his mother was advised by doctors, as many women were at the time, to have another child as soon as possible. On a visit to the first Salvador's grave with his family when he was 5 years old, lore has it, Salvador's father told him that he was the reincarnation of his brother. Dali believed this to be true, once saying of his brother, "We resembled each other like 2 drops of water, but we had different reflections." So I'll stop reading there, and I hope that gives you, everyone, just a little bit of a taste of this book, which is part memoir, part reflection on literary representations of loss and mourning, conversations with my parents and siblings, and all of that kind of put together to honor this child whom I never met, and learn maybe a little bit more about myself and my family as well. So thank you for listening.
Wow, Kristin, this is so interesting and
Thank
so
you.
well written. May I ask several questions?
Of course.
All right. So I don't know if your parents are still living. If so, what do they think of the book?
Right. Well, they actually both passed away fairly recently, but they knew that I was working on it, and they both read an early draft and were very, very supportive. I write about it in the book that my father was a little bit more, has always been, and was, as I wrote the book, a little bit more open and forthcoming. I would ask various questions, and he would email me mostly long answers, which were tremendously helpful in putting this all together. He was very supportive and thrilled that I was doing this. And my mother was as well, but for her, I think it was a little more difficult to dredge up some of these memories and talk about it. So they both knew I was writing about her. They were happy and supportive, but it was difficult as well. And unfortunately, they both passed away before the book was actually published, but they did each read an early draft of it.
And what do you think that Kristin would think?
That's a fascinating question. I hope that she would be pleased that she's not been forgotten. Again, there are those lines I quote from Thomas Lynch, who's an undertaker who has published really fascinating essays and short stories about his work as an undertaker. And he says, the dead don't care. You know, and we know that funerals, for instance, are for the living, not for the deceased, but, and elegies and things like that. But I also have been reading a little bit of Rilke's sympathy letters lately, in which he writes about how the people who had such a strong impact on our lives, the fact that they are now deceased doesn't mean that they're gone or that that impact has disappeared. So I guess I would like to think that she would be pleased to know that her parents stayed together and had 3 more children, and that we have never forgotten her, we've never lost sight of her, and that this book was a way to honor her, as well as to figure out some things in my own life.
And did your parents tell you why they did this, why they named you Kristin? What was their reason?
Yeah, I talk about that in the book as well. The book, Kristin Lavransdatter, was all the rage when my parents met in the 1950s. It was very popular. They both loved the book, and that was one of the first things they bonded over when they first met and started dating. They loved the character of Kristin, and they really loved the name. And so that's why they named the first Kristin. Right. And then when I came along, after my sister and then my brother, and then there was me, they said they still loved the name. They wanted another child named Kristin. They never really talked about it in terms of naming me after her or to kind of memorialize her. A little bit of that came out as I was putting the book together, where my dad wrote in an email, you know, I guess in some way we were trying to keep her alive in some way, that kind of thing. But it was always presented as, we love the name. This is an important book to us, and certainly as a way of honoring their first child as well.
And how old were you when you found out?
I don't remember ever not knowing. So I guess if my first conscious memories are from around age 4 or 5, you know, they didn't talk about her excessively. And I think they tried to keep a lid on their emotions a little bit when the three of us, my brother and sister and I, were children. So we knew there was this first child who had passed away. We saw pictures of her, of course. We had pictures in the house, and there was always a photograph on my parents' dresser and things like that. We knew about her. They would sometimes tell funny little stories about her, things she would do when she was, you know, when she was young. But she wasn't a frequent topic of conversation. So I always knew, but for a long time, it was something I wouldn't even think about. And then something would kind of nudge me or remind me. And I write in the book about several events that happened over the last few years that, and in particular, this video that we saw of her, which was, unbelievable. Can you imagine? Right?
Yeah.
In Technicolor, no less. There she was, opening Christmas presents, blowing out birthday candles, riding a bike, riding a little tricycle outside. It was incredibly powerful and moving. And so that kind of thing we didn't really encounter until we were well into adulthood. So.
And what about your middle name? Is it different?
It is different. Her middle name was Mary and mine is Elizabeth.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that was one of the things my mom used to say, you know, we didn't name you after. See, you have different middle names. You know, it's not exactly the same and that kind of thing. So yeah, different middle names.
Yeah, it's not exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
And what are you writing now? What are you working on these days?
Well, I mentioned in the book towards the end that we found all of the sympathy letters that my parents had received when the first Kristin passed away. And I've written an essay about those, kind of along the same lines, looking at the letters, expressions of sympathy, literary expressions of sympathy over time. So I guess I consider it maybe a bit of a coda to the book, maybe the last piece of the puzzle, so to speak. So I've sent that off into the world to a few venues to see if anyone's interested in publishing it. And I'm working as well on my own academic work. I'm working on an essay on Virginia Woolf and Barbara Pym, who's a novelist I really love, and trying to figure out the fall semester as everybody is.
Thank you, Kristin, and good luck with every single piece of your writing and every one of your projects. Really excited to be talking to you today. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much.